thank you very much. Well, thank you very much to you guys. But first, thank you very much, Jim and Avner. Like, it's always a pleasure to be here, and it's great to be back. It's great that we're back, and COVID interrupted the conference, but it's great to be back to this conference. Thank you also for assigning me as a discussant for this paper. It was down is moving forward. Okay. It was definitely a pleasure to read it and thinking about this paper. I mean, this is high quality theory, and it's a very ambitious paper. It's a very ambitious paper that starts with a very rich setup and yet gets an incredibly simple answer to the question. So, we're going to set up like an incredibly sophisticated model, and then the answer that's going to come out of it is that the way you should measure the social value of welfare is the way that any hedge fund would measure what is in it for us to take that arbitrage on. What would a hedge fund decide before putting any resources into closing an arbitrage? Number one, how big is the arbitrage gap? Number two, how quickly is it going to close when we start trading in it? And that's basically, they get the answer that that's actually the social value of welfare. Basically, all that I'm going to do in my discussion is try to simplify a little bit the interpretation of some of the results. Like, I felt the paper was about 3 layers more complicated than it needed to be. So I'm going to kind of start stripping those layers, make a few suggestions on interpretation, and I have like a few comments at the very end. Okay, so Cecilia did a very good job of explaining the model. In the baseline version, you have a 2-period setup where essentially we're going to have 2 countries. The easiest way to think of it is start them at autarky and then start thinking what's going to happen if we let an arbitrageur get in there and try to close the gap in the 2 interest rates. Okay, so that's basically going to be the nature of the exercise. And throughout the model, the way the arbitrageur is going to be modeled, don't think of any like deep frictions of what prevents them from closing the arbitrage or anything like that. This is a little bit more in the tradition of what Lucas originally did for the cost of business cycles, which is, let me not tell you how we're going to close, how we're going to eliminate business cycles. Let me just see, should we bother? Like, even if we could, should we bother? So it has this nature of assume we had the can opener. I'm not going to tell you what the can opener is or what prevents me from getting a can opener, but assuming we had it, how much would this be worth? So basically, we're going to have 2 agents. They're going to be maximizing some utility, standard budget constraints. These are their endowments. This is how much they're going to be trading. We're going to be using the envelope theorem constantly here, basically, to get stuff. And we're going to start with a situation where originally markets are in autarky. The equilibrium prices PA and PB could differ because, they still like the same good, but they cannot trade with each other. Enter an arbitrageur, and the arbitrageur is going to do the usual long-short thing. They're going to buy some units of the first asset, some units of the second asset, and what you would expect is going to happen here, which is that without too much loss of generality, you can, without actually any loss of generality in the 1-period model, let me be precise about that, you can reparameterize that trade into a direction and a scale. The direction is all a long-short direction. So the thing we're mostly going to be interested in is the scale, like how many units can they trade. Frankly, in this model, and I'm going to keep coming back to this over and over again, the arbitrageurs are just truckers. All right, that's all that they do. Like, it's equivalent to assuming that the fundamental problem in this world is that we don't have trucks going from country A to country B in period 2. And all that we're going to do is allow some trucking so they can move goods from one country to the other. Okay, and actually I'll keep coming back to that because really what we're measuring is the social value of trucking. Okay, the arbitrageurs are a little bit of a red herring in this model. We're going to have, market clearing, that the positions of the arbitrageurs and the agent should be adding up to 0. This is the net trade of each agent. This is how much the arbitrageur puts in one market. Similarly for the other market. And again, without any loss of generality, let's just assume that the price of the good in market B is higher than in market A, aka the interest rates in market B is lower than the interest rate in market A. People in market A are starving today. People in market B are okay today. So we want to somehow do something about that. All right, so then the paper asks, let's start and try to compute what would happen over here if we started marginally changing the scale that we're going to allow. All right, once again, we're not going to tell you what's the friction that prevents that trade. If you want to think about it, is sanctions. Okay, we don't allow those people to move. Now all of a sudden we're going to do a marginal reduction in the sanctions. And it's very easy to I apologize, I have a heck of a time figuring out what's forward and what's backward because it's up and down here. So it's massively confusing. So if we wanted to figure out what is the change of every individual welfare as we change the scale of this trade, it's an incredibly simple application of the envelope theorem, okay? All you have to do is how much the trade is going to change the price of something times how many units is its agent trading. This is going to basically amount to how much more dollars this person is going to be getting in this period times the marginal valuation of $1, okay? And for the arbitrageur, because there the utility is linear, you can kind of decompose it into a product rule, okay? The original change times the marginal change. You add it all up together, and this is what Cecilia was mentioning, the summing up of all the pecuniary externalities. All the pecuniary externalities are going to go away, and the only thing that's going to remain as net welfare for this society is just the difference in the two valuations. So everything else, which is one person loses, one person gains, blah, 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 gets lost. Honestly, like when I saw this, I'm like, that kind of rings bells. Okay, I kind of have seen things like that. In international economics, people do this all the time, all right? And let me just give you a completely equivalent interpretation of how to think about this welfare in terms of something that's called equivalent variation, okay? I'm going to throw out arbitrageur. They're a red herring, okay? All I'm going to do is I'm going to start playing games, playing like thought experiments where I'm going to be giving some money to the first agent and take it away from the second agent, and then doing some compensation trades along the way, all right, to keep them equally happy, all right? So in particular, let's start from the simplest possible experiment, which is, suppose that we give an amount epsilon to agent A in the first period and take it away from agent B. So that's a transfer that's doable, and the social planner here, that's all that he's going to do. Then we can compensate agent B because we want to affect the Pareto improvement. So we're going to tell agent B, we're going to keep you just as happy. How much money do we need to give him? Well, turns out this amount. This amount, if you run it through because they're valuing this epsilon the next period according to PB, for all of this to work out to be exactly $1, the dollar we're taking away from the guy, we have to undo the transfer by 1 over PB, okay? How much have we changed the utility of agent A? The way we have changed the utility of agent A, well, right now we're giving an epsilon more to agent A in the first period. He's happy about that because he's starving this period. We have to take it away next period to compensate agent B. So if we work all of that out, you get something that is a little annoying here, which is the difference in the prices times 1 over PB. Why not just the difference in prices? Well, it turns out it's actually in microeconomics pretty hard to have like a completely unambiguous way of how to monetize an intervention in a market. If I did exactly the same exercise and I took if I measured the unit in consumption from the perspective of, if we compensated agent A instead rather than agent B, the division here would be with 1 over PA rather than 1 over PB. Okay, so there is no immediate way of defining what is the monetary equivalent of a variation. That brings back issues that go back, if you go back in your memory to when you learned micro for the first time. With these welfare comparisons, it's very easy to ask seemingly the same question and get a different number. The easiest case is equivalent variation versus compensated variation. Compensated variation, all of you who have young kids, you do that all the time, what a compensated variation is. Daddy, you promised you're going to take me there. Sorry, I can't do it. Okay, I'll buy you a toy. Okay, so that's compensated variation. Equivalent variation is much more like, the best analogy I can think of is the crooked politician analogy. Somebody comes and says, we're going to pass this law, you know, it's going to be good, it's going to be, but you need to make some contribution to our party. Like, how big is the maximum contribution you'd make to make sure that this thing passes? That's equivalent variation. And it would seem you should be getting the same answer. Turns out, unless you have quasi-linear preferences, you don't. So it turns out, for this particular paper, to get exactly the same answer that the paper does, you need to do the following, all right? You need to say, for this specific welfare criterion that the authors are using, you need to say, okay, imagine that we transfer suppose that we transfer epsilon units of the good from investor A to investor B in the second period. So in the second period, we're just going to take money from the one agent and give it to the other by epsilon units. Okay. And now, what we're going to do in period 0 is compensate both of them for that. Okay. So in particular, the way we're going to compensate, it turns out the way you need to compensate these agents to be exactly as well off as if you didn't do the transfer, okay, this is what equivalent variation is all about, is to transfer PA times epsilon to investor A and take this many units from investor B. Okay, so those turn out to be the right amounts you need to take away from, or like add in their first period consumption depending, to make them just as well off. But here's the point, that in period 1, the transfer you're making to investor A is smaller than what you're taking from investor B. So you as the social planner, you kept them both equally well off, and yet you created new resources for the society. So that's one, and that's measured in units of consumption today. So that's measured in dollars rather than in something else. So turns out that if you take that concept, if we agree, so to say, that's the point I'm trying to make, that if we agree that we are going to evaluate the welfare benefits through this equivalent variation lens, through this gap in equivalent variations of the two agents, then it turns out that the marginal change in welfare in this society is exactly what the paper says it should be. Okay. Now, what's the advantage of doing that? You can avoid arbitrageurs. You can avoid a lot of headaches. All right. You can basically say, as long as we agree that that's the way we're going to quantify the value of welfare, you get exactly this very simple, transparent expression that the paper is getting, that in principle you could go out in data and measure it. So again, an interpretation of what this welfare is suppose we let the trackers go through, okay, and then we compute, well, now that we're going to be changing the consumption of these agents, let's figure out what is the equivalent variation of this change for each of them, how much it's worth to them, and the gap in those valuations. That's exactly what the paper is measuring. Okay, so let me run very quickly through some comments. The paper goes relatively quickly from a marginal change to a total change. They're going like they're saying, okay, let's think of a value of completely closing the gap all the way. And they're saying, well, to get at that, you can start from this little marginal change that I make, from these epsilons, add them all up. Turns out that in order to do that, and you see it in my alternative interpretation of this welfare criterion, you would need to be changing how much you compensate along the way. So for the first unit, you have to change the compensation differently than for the second, and for the third, and for the fourth unit. You can't keep the weights in the welfare function fixed. And that actually happens in their paper too, that implicitly what they're doing is in that social welfare function, they have to keep adjusting those weights along the way to make this just an application of. So all I'm trying to say is that my interpretation of what the paper is doing, the tracking interpretation and their interpretation, starts becoming a little bit different when we're looking at a marginal versus an overall. And I think that's because I have like a little bit of a tough time thinking of how I define a welfare function where I change the welfares depending on how much is the intervention that I'm making. Okay, one little detail. Okay, The intertemporal version of the model gave me a headache. All right, that was, whew. And the irony of it all is that, I can run you through and tell you why it becomes so complicated, but let me kind of give you like the big picture. The big picture is you're going to get a massive mess when you have these arbitrageurs, where you force them to be closing their trades in all future periods and only in period one, connecting all the scale to be the same across all periods and all that. You're going to pick up a bunch of this stuff, and then when they're going to go in the data, they're going to basically all these very difficult section of the paper where we're going to be writing out all those formulas reminded me a little bit like those monks that create these beautiful mosaics, and then they take a sweep and go whoop, because none of that gets used in the empirical section. None of it, okay? So I would have argued, just do my welfare criterion, my interpretation of what this measure really means on a rolling basis. So say suppose that period by period we play this game, where we are thinking of a situation where we're allowing the planner to allow the trackers by an epsilon just for the next period and just for the next period. And then you avoid another really difficult issue, which is this is measured, this is a stock number, this is welfare change over many periods. Whereas what the paper is really measuring in the data is a flow, a period by period. So in order to have that be exact, you kind of need to go along my way on that way. And the simpler interpretation of this being just a difference in the 1 period forward marginal valuations. Compensatory valuations. Okay, let me skip this. CIP version of the model, you know what? I'll skip this as well in the interest of time. Let me kind of get to the final comment I want to make. All right, empirically, I'm not going to say that to this audience. It's pretty obvious. You have a quantity, so you have price on the right, a quantity on the right, a price on the left, a quantity on the right. You have endogeneity issues, okay? The paper assumes that there is only price impact on the exchange rate side. When I read exactly what they do to measure those gains, I kind of got a little bit stuck on this point, which is that they're assuming that as we keep on trading, we're going to change the forward rates, we're going to change the exchange rate, but we're not really going to move the interest rates. That threw me a little bit back, because in the model, to get the welfare gains, you're going to have to change the interest rates. So to put it very bluntly here, if you're going to go tell all of you guys, let's translate the welfare gains that they're getting in the paper, which is $1,000, okay? They'll say, all right, for if I were to do all the translations and all that, is would you be contributing $1,000 to close the CIP violation, say the US versus the euro? Most of you would say, heck no, just give me the $1,000. Why would I want to contribute to this? If I ask the question a little bit differently, which is, would you be willing to pay $1,000? And the people that you have who are handling your money are going to be able to increase the rates of return you're getting on your investments by 10 basis points. Well, now I have you listening. So if you're going to assume in the evaluation of the welfare gains that this is not going to trickle down to the representative investor, it is very hard to say how this is not just intervening in a zero net supply market where people just become richer. Just going back to where I started, that this seems to be the calculation a hedge fund would be doing to see how much more money. It's calculating the value of something that's a zero net supply transfer. In order to make this, to attach the more fancy name welfare gain, you kind of have to assume that this is going to trickle down to the investor. You're going to have to assume that whatever gains this hedge fund is making, it's going to get passed on to the rates of return of the investor. So conclusion, very nice paper. It's a very ambitious paper, okay? And the thing that I really like about it is that I like the answer that you get at the end. I really like the answer. I like the simplicity of it. I like that it allows us to, expose the answer seems kind of obvious, but exposed, all right? Ex ante, when you go into it, you start thinking, oh, I'm going to get these marginal effects and the gaps and the valuation, blah, 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 blah. No, they tell you just, it's actually much simpler than what you thought. And that's what I really like about this paper, that allows you to get our hands. I would have to say that if I take a bird's eye view of this calculation, the way I would try to pitch it to somebody of why should we care about closing these CIP violations, why they could actually matter for the representative investor, is because they might give us a way to raise the rate of return that we're getting on our investments in pension plans, in insurance companies, in blah, 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 that then kind of trickle down to us. And the paper has that flavor to it, and it might be a much more palatable way, let's put it this way, to translate this and explain why this is relevant. Thanks.